Look at any military uniform from history and you're basically looking at the world's most expensive kick me sign. We spent thousands of years dressing soldiers in the most visible, impractical, please shoot me first outfits imaginable, and we called it professionalism. Bright red coats and green forests. White pants and muddy trenches. Tall, fuzzy hats that said, "I'm important, aim here." It took humanity until roughly the 20th century to figure out that maybe, just maybe, standing out on a battlefield was a shit idea. So we start with the Greeks and Romans, who had the right idea by accident. Bronze armor, leather skirts, those iconic helmets with the mohawk crests, it all actually made sense for their style of warfare. You're fighting in a phalanx where everyone needs to recognize everyone else, and armor actually stops swords and spears, so sure, shine that bronze until it blinds your enemy. Romans even color-coded their legions because military bureaucracy apparently predates actual bureaucracy. But here's where it gets stupid. Officers wore different crests and decorations so everyone knew who to follow, which also meant every enemy knew exactly who to kill first. Centurions with their sideways crests might as well have worn name tags saying, "I'm in charge, I'm worth extra points." The armor worked, the organization worked, but the whole let's make leaders conspicuous thing was a decision that would haunt military fashion for the next 2,000 years. Medieval armor is what happens when you let rich people design military equipment. Full plate armor cost about as much as a small village, which meant only nobility could afford to not die immediately. Everyone else got a padded jacket and a prayer. Knights looked absolutely magnificent. Gleaming steel, heraldic designs, plumes and engravings. And they were genuinely well protected against other knights, which was great for the 0.01% of warfare that was rich guys jousting each other. For actual battles where peasants with poleaxes could just tip you over like a turtle, less great. The whole system was basically military Gucci, where your outfit cost more than your house and proved you'd never done real work. And tournaments turned it into a fashion show where knights literally judged each other's armor aesthetics while pretending it was about combat readiness. By the late medieval period, armor got so ornate and impractical that some pieces were purely ceremonial, too beautiful to risk damaging in actual combat, which is the most aristocratic bullshit sentence I've ever written. Then guns showed up and said fuck your fancy armor to everyone's extremely expensive metal suits. Suddenly that plate armor that took a master craftsman 6 months to make could be penetrated by a peasant with 2 weeks of musket training, and the military fashion industry had to pivot hard. But instead of immediately going practical, Europe decided to double down on stupid. The 17th and 18th centuries gave us uniforms that looked like they were designed by someone who'd never seen a battlefield. Bright colors, red, white, blue, yellow, tight-fitting coats, powdered wigs, buckled shoes, and those tricorn hats that were about as tactically useful as a fedora. The logic was that in the smoke and chaos of black powder warfare, you needed to see who was who, which is technically true, but maybe the solution wasn't dress everyone like they're going to a very formal funeral. Different regiments wore different colors and facings so you could tell the Royal Scots from the King's Own by their jacket trim while you were all dying together. Peak military fashion was basically peacocking with muskets. Napoleon's era represents the absolute pinnacle of looking good is more important than not dying. French soldiers wore blue coats with white pants. White pants on a battlefield where you're marching through mud, blood, and various human fluids. The British stuck with red coats because fuck camouflage, we're the British Empire. Hussars wore fur-lined jackets draped over one shoulder like a cape, tight pants, and more gold braiding than a pimp's jacket, because apparently cavalry needed to look like they were heading to the most dangerous nightclub in Europe. Grenadiers wore bearskin hats that added a foot to their height, making them easier to shoot but more intimidating, which is a trade-off that makes sense only if you're insane. Officers wore massive bicorn hats, sashes, epaulets, and carried swords that were more decorative than functional. The entire Napoleonic Wars looked like a period drama where everyone's costume budget was unlimited and practicality was never discussed. Soldiers froze in Russia wearing these outfits designed for looking impressive on parade grounds, not surviving a Moscow winter. And the uniforms literally contributed to deaths because fashion mattered more than warmth. It's honestly impressive how badly we understood warfare. Americans, being contrarian colonials, actually stumbled into practicality by accident during the Revolution. Riflemen wore hunting clothes in browns and greens because that's what they owned, and it accidentally worked as camouflage. The British looked at this and called it uncivilized, which is peak British energy, criticizing your enemy's fashion sense while they're shooting you from behind trees you can't see them behind. But even America couldn't resist the siren call of stupid uniforms for long. By the War of 1812, we had our own blue coats and white cross belts, because apparently we wanted to look legitimate and professional, which meant looking European, which meant looking like a target. The Civil War continued this tradition, with both sides wearing easily identifiable colors: Union blue, Confederate gray, tight wool uniforms in summer heat, and keeping many of the impractical European elements. Some Confederate units wore butternut brown out of necessity. They couldn't afford proper dye, and historians later realized those guys were accidentally camouflaged better than everyone else. Both sides had Zouave units that wore French-inspired outfits with baggy pants, short jackets, and fezzes. Because if you're going to die in a war, you might as well die looking like you're cosplaying a North African soldier for reasons nobody can adequately explain. The British Empire finally learned something after enough of their red-coated soldiers got picked off in colonial wars. Indian troops wore khaki, literally Hindi for dust-colored, and shockingly, they didn't stand out like bloodstains on snow. British officers in India started adopting it in the 1840s, and by the Boer War in 1899, the whole army was transitioning to khaki because Boer farmers kept shooting their conspicuously dressed soldiers with alarming accuracy. This was revolutionary thinking. What if we wore colors that matched the environment? Took humanity roughly 5,000 years to figure this out. Other countries saw Britain's survival rate improve and thought, hey, maybe we should also not dress our soldiers like parade floats. The US adopted khaki, then olive drab. Germany went with Feldgrau, field gray. France initially said fuck you to the entire concept and kept their blue coats and red pants into World War I, because apparently French military tradition was worth more than French lives. It took hundreds of thousands of casualties for France to finally admit that maybe, possibly, standing out on a battlefield was contraindicated, and they switched to horizon blue in 1915, which was better, but still more visible than it needed to be because French pride is immortal. World War I is where uniforms finally started making sense, forced by industrialized warfare that turned individual heroism into a statistical joke. Everyone ended up in muddy trenches, wearing earth-toned uniforms, steel helmets, goodbye fancy hats, and practical boots. The Germans had their distinctive Stahlhelm that actually protected your head. The British had the Brodie helmet that looked like a pie tin but worked. And the French finally adopted practical colors after their peacetime uniforms got so many soldiers killed that it became a national scandal. Gas masks became standard equipment, which really completed the anonymous industrial death aesthetic. Officers still tried to maintain some distinction with different insignia and sometimes binoculars, but the days of plumes and gold braid on the front lines were over, because snipers existed and were very good at their jobs. Uniforms became about function, pockets for equipment, durable fabric, colors that didn't scream, "shoot me," reinforced knees for crawling through mud. It only took the worst war in human history to that point to make military fashion sensible. The trenches were the great equalizer, where rich and poor, officer and enlisted all wore the same mud-caked outfit and died with equal efficiency, which is maybe the only democratic thing about World War I. World War II saw the first genuinely smart uniform innovations, probably because technology was advancing faster than tradition could stop it. Camouflage patterns were developed scientifically. The Germans had their splinter pattern, the Soviets had their amoeba pattern, and various nations experimented with breaking up the human outline. Paratroopers got specialized jumpsuits. Tankers got coveralls. Winter troops got white snow gear. Revolutionary, I know. The US developed different uniforms for different theaters. Olive drab for Europe, camouflage for the Pacific. The Marines' island-hopping campaigns led to actual jungle warfare uniforms with better ventilation and patterns designed for tropical environments. Germans had different uniforms for Africa, Russia, and Western Europe because they'd learned that one-size-fits-all gets you killed in environments ranging from deserts to tundra. Body armor started making a comeback with flak jackets for aircrew and assault troops. It wasn't medieval plate mail, but practical protection against shrapnel, which was responsible for most injuries anyway. Uniforms had better load-bearing equipment, integrated pockets for specific gear, and were designed by people who'd actually fought instead of aristocrats who thought warfare was aesthetic. World War II uniforms looked less impressive on parade, but kept you alive longer in combat, which is the fucking bare minimum we should expect from military clothing. After World War II, uniform development became an arms race of practicality and technology. Camouflage got sophisticated with patterns like woodland, desert, and digital designs that actually worked based on science instead of someone's artistic vision. Body armor evolved from flak jackets to Kevlar vests to plate plate carriers that could stop rifle rounds. The US went through multiple uniform changes: Vietnam-era jungle fatigues, 1980s woodland BDUs, early 2000s digital ACU pattern, which worked nowhere and was universally hated, and finally the current OCP pattern that's actually decent. Night vision equipment meant uniforms needed to consider infrared signatures. Integrated communications gear required new pocket and antenna designs. Boots evolved from leather to synthetic materials with better support. Modern uniforms are genuine PPE that incorporate decades of research, material science, and feedback from actual combat. Soldiers today wear flame-resistant fabrics, moisture-wicking layers, integrated body armor, helmet-mounted electronics, and camouflage patterns designed by computers to exploit how human vision works. It's the difference between a costume and equipment. Special forces get even fancier gear that costs more than my car. The modern soldier looks like a sci-fi character compared to their grandfather in World War II, and that's what military uniform evolution should have been doing all along, making soldiers more effective and more likely to survive, not more impressive at state funerals. So we went from Bronze Age bling to medieval bankruptcy suits to Napoleonic fashion disasters to finally, mercifully, uniforms designed by people who understand that the point of a soldier is to win and survive, not to look magnificent while dying. It took humanity roughly 5,000 years and millions of unnecessary deaths to figure out that camouflage beats crimson, and that protecting soldiers matters more than impressing them. Modern military uniforms are genuinely impressive achievements of material science and design, which makes it even more absurd that for most of military history, we dressed soldiers like they were competing in a pageant where the prize was getting shot first. Every war uniform tells you what that era valued. Ancient armies valued unit cohesion. Medieval knights valued class distinction. Napoleonic armies valued tradition and appearance. And modern militaries finally value soldiers coming home alive. The evolution of military uniforms is basically the story of humans slowly, painfully learning that reality doesn't care about your traditions, your aesthetics, or your pride. Physics and bullets will humble you eventually. We just wish it hadn't taken quite so many elaborate uniforms and quite so many funerals to figure that out.